people could make sure their phones are on silent so that we don't get interrupted by phones ringing halfway through the meeting. Thank you. Right, well, it's 10 o'clock, so we'll make a start. And welcome to the Development Management meeting. Apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Councillor Southcott. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Before we go further, I will ask members of the committee to introduce themselves so that people who have joined us today know who's who. Councillor Jury, if I could start with you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Councillor Neil Jory and I am the ward member for Tamar Ford Ward.
Sam Wakeham, Councillor for Hatherley.
Jeff Moody, Tavistock North.
Tony Leach, Oakhampton North.
Alistair Cunningham, Buckland Monacorum.
Ursula Mann, Tavistock North.
Caroline Mott, Bridistow Ward.
Steve Guthrie, Drew Stainton Ward.
Bryony Hanlon, and I'm the case officer.
Jacqueline Houselander, Head of Development Management for West Devon.
Rick Cheadle, Councillor for Buckland Monacorum and Chair of the Planning Committee.
Good morning, David Fairbairn, Head of Legal Services Monitoring Officer.
Cathy Hall, West Devon Borough Council Democratic Services Officer.
There's one bit of admin we do before we get on with the business in hand, and that is, as you know, Councillor Southcott is not with us today and is unlikely to be with us until probably Christmas at the earliest, which means we don't at the moment have a vice chair. And I think it's a good idea to have a vice chair just in case I can't be here for any reason. I've had a volunteer to take up the role of Vice Chair, Councillor Mott. Could I have a seconder for that? All in favour? Congratulations, Councillor Mott, you are the Vice Chair of the committee. Okay, we'll move on to item 3 on the agenda, which is the declaration of interests. And in accordance with our code of conduct, members are invited to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests, other registrable interests and non-registrable interests, including the nature and extent of such interests they may have in any items to be considered at this meeting. Does anyone have any declarations of interest to declare? Councillor Wakeham.
I'm speaking against the Park Road application and I am predetermined.
Any others? Well, if there are, sing out as we go along. Item 4, items requiring urgent attention. None have been brought to my notice, so we'll move on to item 5, which is the confirmation of the minutes. Can I take those as an accurate record of our previous meeting? Anyone got any comments they wish to make on those? No, thank you. We now have a short statement from our legal officer.
Thank you, Chairman. I've agreed with the Chair that for the benefit of members of the public and substitute members who may not be so familiar with the process by which planning applications are determined, that I explain the basic principles at the beginning of each meeting of the committee. The committee's starting point is a statutory requirement to have regard to the policies of the development plan. In this case, the development plan is the joint local plan and any made neighbourhood plan, and have regard to any other material planning considerations. Material planning considerations are those matters that are concerned with the use and development of land in the public interest. Anything that does not serve that purpose is irrelevant and the committee will not consider it. The committee's decision will be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations suggest otherwise. The rationale for this is that the development plan is intended to be a carefully drafted and considered statement of policy published to inform the public of the approach which we followed when making planning decisions, unless there's good reason to depart from it. So the committee will consider whether the proposed development complies with the development plan as a whole. The joint local plan, like all the development plans, contains broad statements of policy and is not unusual. Indeed, it's very likely that one or more policies that apply to a proposed development will pull in different directions. So a development policy, a proposal may be in accord with development plan policies which, for example, encourage employment purposes, and yet be contrary to policies which seek to protect open countryside. In such cases, the committee will make a judgment, bearing in mind such factors as the relative importance of the relevant policies and the extent to which the development proposal complies with them or does not. Otherwise, the development plan policies are to be read sensibly and the words interpreted and given their natural and ordinary meaning. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. We have one planning application in front of us today, which is 138424, outline planning, land at Park Road, Hatherley. And at this point, I will hand over to the planning officer for her brief.
Chair, sorry, just before we hand over to the planning officer, I just wanted to make a comment which I think is important to make at this stage. The objector to the development had contacted me some time ago to ask if I'd had a meeting with the applicant, a sort of pre-app meeting with the applicant. I unfortunately forgot that I'd had a meeting. My colleague reminded me of the meeting that we had. It was some time ago, and so I did have a meeting with the applicant prior to the submission. Well, submission of the previous application which was a certificate application, which was refused. And then, so I did have a meeting, and I suggested to them that they should make a new application on the basis that the planning history would be a material planning consideration, i.e. there had been a previous approval on the site. I did not in any way give them any guarantee that they would gain that permission. I merely told them that that was the approach that I suggested they take. So I just wanted to make that statement very clear at the beginning here, so that members and the public are all aware of that my error, in fact. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the planning officer then.
Okay, so this application is obviously at Park Road, Hatherley. It's an outline and it's for 2 dwellings with access and then other matters reserved. So this obviously is the aerial view of the site, and the position of the application site is marked in a green diamond, just so that you can see the relationship of the site to the town. This is the site location map, so the application site is outlined in red and other land that the applicant owns is outlined in blue. You can see the neighbouring dwellings surrounding the site and the relationship to the road. In 22, an application was granted for the relocation of the vehicular access into the site. This is that site location plan with the works, just so that you've got that for background. The proposed block plan, and a drawing to indicate the location of the northern boundary hedge. So for those of you that braved the rainy site visit, these photos will look quite familiar. So this is the existing access into the site. So I'm standing in Park Road at the moment when this photo was taken. Inside the site, looking north, so you can see the land's rising. And the dwelling that you can see in the photo is Daisy's. And this is standing at almost the very top of the site. Apologies for the rain. Just to show you how the land is enclosed by mature vegetation. So view south, so that you can see the surrounding dwellings, and you can see members of the planning committee right at the bottom of the photo. And the view south from within the site. This is the view east along Park Road, just to show the neighbouring dwellings. And the view west, just so that you can see There's a black car in the very distance, you probably can't see it, just to show you where the 30 mile an hour speed limit ends. So the key issues for the application, obviously you've already read the report. So the planning history, outline permission was granted in 2018 for 2 dwellings, but that has now lapsed. In 22, there was an application to relocate the vehicular access. That's a standalone application, and that permission is still extant. In 2019, the joint local plan was adopted, and the local planning authority can now demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. And the supplementary planning document sets out how we will consider sites adjacent to the higher tier settlements. The site is within the 30 mile an hour speed limit, and you can walk into Hatherley. Some of us did that on the site visit. And then officers consider that the reserved matters application will control any of the technical matters. On this basis, officer recommendation is conditional approval.
Okay, thank you very much for that and for a pretty comprehensive report. Members of the Planning Committee, do you have any questions at this stage for the Planning Officer? Councillor Moody.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question, going back to the site map. I notice across the field there's a dotted brown line that goes under the right-hand, under plot 2. Can you explain what that is?
I'm not sure what that one is, actually. So we can perhaps ask the applicant when they do their presentation.
I noticed when I was on site that the topography down the right-hand side looked like quite a ridge, and it went up to a knoll at the time. Is there any historic significance in that? Because I can't see anything in this report that covers any possible historic sites, etc.
So not that we're aware of at this stage.
Any other questions for the Planning Officer? I have one, just clarification in my own mind, really. If you go back to the position of the outline position of the 2 houses, that picture, that one there, that is purely indicative of where the houses might be within the site. It's not prescriptive in that sense at all, is it?
So this is just to show that the site is big enough to accommodate 2 dwellings, vehicular access, and enough space for outdoor amenity space for the houses.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions for the Planning Officer? Okay, we have 3 registered speakers today. Before I ask Mr. Watts to come up and talk to us, just a brief for anyone coming to the table here. Whatever you have to say to us is timed. The objectors and supporters have 3 minutes, and I'll have a little stopwatch here. A ward member, Councillor Wakeham, who I think is going to speak, will have up to 5 minutes to say what you have to say. So, without further ado, I will ask Mr. Watts to come and talk to us. Morning, Mr. Watts. Yeah, could you just put your microphone on? No, I won't start the watch on.
My apologies about my voice. I have a cold. Can you hear me okay? I contacted Jacqueline the day that the application appeared online because in the application, Mr. Flowers makes a statement that he'd had a meeting with Jacqueline Houselander in advance of the application being submitted, and that she had told him in that meeting that it was the opinion of West Devon that they would support the application if it was submitted. This is all in black and white. I have the emails between us. So I contacted Jacqueline saying, if this is the case, what's the point of having a planning meeting? He's saying that you've said that this is a rubber stamping process. And Jacqueline said to me that what she could tell me was that at no point while she was a planning officer or head of planning had she ever met Mr. Flowers, and that she would draw the attention of this to the planning officer, Bryony, and that she would come back to me. That was the middle of May. Since then, I've sent 5 other emails to both of them saying this statement, and it actually appears in 2 places in the application. It appears in the application form itself and in a document, I think it's the design and access statement. And the effect of having that statement present in the application is clearly going to influence people who read the application online and would say, well, and I've experienced it because I've spoken to neighbours, they've said, well, there's no point because this has already been approved. So for Jacqueline to now say, without responding to me since the middle of May, despite telling me in the middle of May that she would come back to me, and despite me sending emails, at least 5, saying what's going on, why is this statement allowed to exist in the application? And she's just confirmed that that isn't a true statement if it was a meeting and she didn't tell Paul Flowers that it was a straightforward matter of, we've told you we will support this application. How has that not been addressed either by way of redaction or by way of saying, no, you need to apply again without that statement? Because if it's acknowledged to be untrue, my own experience of dealing with planning is that if I refer to somebody as a partner or a miss, I can get so many comments redacted in the application that, you know, it doesn't seem right that here we are, since the middle of May, I've made all of these attempts to find out what's going on, why is it still the case, and here we are now, Jacqueline suddenly remembered a meeting with the applicant.
Thank you for that. I don't want the planning meeting to get in. No, I understand your point completely. But what I will say is that the planning committee will hear from you, from others, from the planning officer. What was or wasn't said at a pre-application meeting will not cloud our judgment on whether we think this is a suitable application to support or not.
It's clearly affected the way that this application has appeared to members of the public.
No, I take your point. Right, you're here to talk about the application. You have 3 minutes, so in your own time, press the button and off you go.
Why are we here? Because in 2018, the first application was made when West Devon had no adopted 5-year housing supply plan in place, meaning that there had to be a presumption in favour of sustainable development.
Could I ask you just to move the microphone slightly closer to you? Thanks very much. No. Okay.
The report produced by the planning officer included, if West Devon plan had been adopted, the application fell outside this policy. The most important view of the site was from the historic Jubilee footpath and because of this, planners were of the opinion that low-profile bungalows set well down the hillside would be required to comply with any permission. The existing field entrance would be used. Less than 5 metres of ancient hedgerow would be impacted. The dominant view of the site after development would be the agricultural land behind it. The applicant's ecologist stated that there was no evidence of badger activity within a kilometre of the site. Committee approved the application 6-4 because of this. Unfortunately, not everything was conditioned in the decision notice made by committee. At reserved matters stage, the planning officer permitted the 2 houses to become much larger. To add further protection to the ancient hedgerow, the 2 plots were to be set further up the hillside, and the access visibility display was reduced from 8 metres to 43, not 43 in each direction. The entrance point and agricultural land behind remained the same. This applicant sold Biddicombe in November 20 without retaining the land required to comply with the existing access permission. Another application was submitted and approved, meaning that 16 metres of ancient hedgerow was to be impacted. The presence of badgers on the site was now acknowledged. This application has been unstoppable up to now. West Devon now have an adopted plan. There is currently no planning permission for development on the site. This applicant is totally responsible for letting the previous permission lapse and not for being able to comply with conditions. Ancient hedgerow are supposed to be protected by law and the JLP. The existing field entrance was always emphasised as being used to protect it. You have seen the hedgerow, it's so big, how can you move or reuse it? There are 2 badger sets on the perimeter of the field, and they're supposed to be protected. True and safe access cannot be achieved due to the bend in the road and the size of the Biddicombe hedge. You have seen what's happened before. Don't let history repeat itself. The price to our environment is too high. There is no actual need for houses on this site. The proposed development has morphed beyond all recognition from what was originally approved.
Just sit tight, if I could ask you. Members of the Planning Committee, have you got any questions you would wish to raise with Mr. Watts? No? Okay, thank you very much. The next registered speaker is Mr. Pearce, who is the agent. Welcome. You know the rules. You 2 will have 3 minutes, not a second more. I think we'll take those in questions.
I've got a couple of queries that weren't included in my, and from what's been said just now, and I wonder if I just might raise those, because if I don't raise them now, I won't necessarily get the opportunity to. I'm not trying to be difficult, it's just there was a couple of things said, and I just wanted to clarify with the officer if that's correct or not.
All right.
There were 2 things that were said. Firstly, that layout was not a consideration. My understanding, looking at the application form and reading the report, layout is being considered, and I just wanted to clarify that point, because that was my understanding of the application.
This application?
This application, Ms. Handon said that layout, or as I understood it, wasn't being considered. My understanding is that it is. The box has been ticked on the application form, so I just wanted members to be sure, and I need to be sure what actually is being considered.
We've got the question.
Is the first point.
One for the planning officer. Can you?
I'll need to double check.
My understanding was this was an outline planning permission
with access and layout being considered.
That's
what the form shows.
I think it just wasn't in the description, so that's kind of what I need to. I'll just check.
The form.
Okay, we'll check that.
Okay, and the second point was, and this is a point of clarification that I think members need to be aware of, that the application, the earlier application, 1685/18, the original outline, was actually granted in August 2019, not in 2018, as was said in the officers.
Right. we're not having a debate.
As members will know, applications are not granted planning permission until the Section 106 agreement is
Can we check
signed.
that too?
And the actual decision...
Record when it was. The question was, when was the original application granted?
Chairman, your committee report clearly says August 2019.
Okay. Those are two relevant and possibly important facts, so I'll just draw a halt to this meeting while we sort that out. That's fine. Councillor Jerry.
Thank you. Just on that point, the paper that is in front of us does say the layout is also being included.
The questions raised by the agent.
You need to wait for him to say.
Questions raised by the agent are, in my view, significant. because the officer's report leads you to the conclusion that the layout is not part of the determination today, whereas the application very clearly says it is. So I'm going to defer this application so that the report can be adjusted, because I don't want this to become a cause célèbre for the way that this committee runs. So I'm going to delay this application. It will come back at the next planning meeting when the officer's report will make it clear exactly what it is that we are considering. Yeah. By which time also we will, and this will also appear in the report, clear up the business of dates and which side of the JLP various things like, and what the significance of that is, if any. So, committee, do I have your agreement to postpone this? Please show. Thank you. So I'm sorry to have brought everyone to this committee this way, but I look forward to seeing you all when next we meet. Thank you. Okay, we now move on to item 8 of the agenda, which is planning appeals update. I turn to Mrs. Hauslander for that. Councillor Wakeham, can we have you back in the meeting now? Thank you.
So members will have seen quite a long list of appeals on the agenda. Many of them are either awaiting a decision or they've had their start letter received. The start letter is the time at which officers need to, they would have received the appeal and officers need to submit a statement. So there's a number in that scenario within the list. But there are a few which need to be discussed. It's noted that application 259023 FUL, we actually discussed this at the last meeting, so I'm not proposing to discuss it again. So I'm moving on to 2590. Find it. Yeah, 2590 is that's the one that's already been described. Sorry, it's 2280. Sorry. So it's land adjacent to Wayleaves, Monkokehampton. It was actually refused by officers on the basis that it lay in a flood zone. And when any applications are within a flood zone 2 or 3, we need to do what's called a sequential test. And that means that we have to consider whether there are other sites within a set area that could accommodate those dwellings if to avoid putting development in a flood zone. The Environment Agency had sent an objection in to us to say that they felt it was within the flood zone. However, in this case, the applicant went to great expense and extent to carry out a much more detailed flood risk assessment and came to the conclusion that it was not within the floodplain, and therefore, in their view, we should be granting consent. However, the Environment Agency refused to change their concerns because they said that it would have to result in a challenge to the Environment Agency flood map. And as a result, they maintained their objection. But the inspector, in reviewing the work that the applicant had done, decided that it was more detailed than probably the work that the Environment Agency had done, and therefore he was persuaded that the application should be allowed on that basis.
Thank you very much. Just one question. Does that mean that the Environment Agency's flood map would then be modified in accord with the new evidence?
As far as I understand it, the modification would need to occur with the applicant challenging the Environment Agency flood map.
So it's not a case law type thing where it would automatically amend it? Okay.
And I suspect he won't now because he's got his permission. So, you know, I don't, but I mean, it does, in the Environment Agency information, it does say that, you know, it is done to a level of detail, but not, sorry.
It begs the next question, that in future decisions by officers, can we rely 100% on the flood map?
Well, I suppose that is a, you know, and in terms of the planning balance, I think we probably need to think about how we deal with that. And there will be some cases where it clearly is in the flood zone and there's not an issue, but it's those where there's a bit of a, you know, there's a margin, so maybe partly in the flood zone and partly not. You know, as a service, we might need to think about, do we go against that technical advice on the basis that, particularly if, as in this case, the applicant had done quite a lot of work to get to a point where he had.
But the other question is that the Environment Agency is a statutory consultee. Yeah. As with highways, you can't object to the advice given by a statutory consultee like highways or.
Well, hence why the recommendation was for yeah. But I think there is opportunity if we are persuaded by other evidence. You know, we have to come up with a recommendation for you to consider based on evidence that's before us. And if a statutory consultee does come back with a you know, an objection which is then challenged, albeit not in the official way, we must consider it. But it's very often very difficult to go against a technical statutory consultee in that way. So I wouldn't expect us to be doing this on a regular basis at all, but it does beg the question. I agree.
Sorry, Councillor.
Just consideration, when you said that the applicant had done a lot of work, does that mean he'd done a lot of research or he'd done some mitigation work that affected the floodplain?
He'd done a full flood risk assessment as requested by us. Right. It was just that the Environment Agency.
Thank you.
27723 HHO, Willow Tree Farm, Sanford Courtney. This was a householder application for an extension upwards, as I recall, and the planning recommendation was for refusal because it was considered that it was an incongruous addition. Extensions upwards are quite often slightly more difficult for us to consider because they can completely change the character of a building without careful thought. But the inspector felt that because the building, the dwelling was set back on the site and there was significant landscaping around the site, that he or she considered that it was acceptable. That's that one. The next one, 348622. There's two appeals on this site. It's Higher Southcombe Farm, Northlew. The one application was for a dwelling and the other was for a wellness centre. Both of them were dismissed by the inspector. There were quite a number of reasons for refusal on both of them, based on unjustified development in the countryside, an unsustainable location, overly large. In terms of the house, it would exacerbate the existing parish imbalance of house types. And the design was felt to be unacceptable. And in this case as well, there was the access was in a flood zone, and there was concern that were there to be a flood, whilst the house may not be in the flood zone, the access would, because the access was in the flood zone, it would prevent escape by occupants. In terms of the wellness centre, similarly, it was felt to be in an unsustainable location, inappropriate design. There was potential impact on neighbours from the traffic and access to the flood zone. The inspector agreed with the officer's recommendation on the basis, in terms of the house, that he agreed that it was in an unsustainable location and harm to the character and appearance of the area, but also said he didn't consider the flood risk to be an issue, and that was for both applications. But he also weighed up, interestingly, so this is quite of interest, because this wellness centre was an economic development, effectively, and with our discussions that we've had on a number of occasions around Dev 15, he considered, obviously the economic benefits needed to be considered in this case, but he felt that whilst there would be some economic benefit of the wellness centre, it did not outweigh the environmental harm. Quite an interesting one if you wanted to go and look at the details of the case, I think, in relation to our Dev 15 issue. And then finally, there's 1771-23, full land at Chichicot, conversion of a barn to a dwelling. It was refused because it was, again, in an unsustainable location and a poor design. In this case, it was quite an attractive barn, which was considered to be a non-designated heritage asset by the officer, and the concern was that it would affect the character of that barn. And whilst the inspector felt that it would affect the character, he was sort of almost persuaded by the fact that if you converted it to a dwelling, it would be have a new use and therefore be retained. But he didn't go along with it entirely, and he said that the design didn't really have proper regard to the detailing that's already in the building. So so that was dismissed as well. So a mixed bag of appeals, a couple allowed, and 3 dismissed.
Any questions on those before we move on? Okay, we're now on to the next item on the agenda, which is undetermined major applications. And this is your opportunity to raise any of them that you wish to. Wool Grading Centre, still there. Councillor Mann.
I just noticed that we're still doing Section 106 agreements. It's taking quite a long time for the Section 106 agreements on several of them, and I just wondered how long that usually takes as a process and whether or not there's like an expected time.
I might hand over to our legal officer to answer that question. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm not aware there's a particular problem with Section 106 agreements, but if you've got a particular matter in mind, I'm happy to discuss it outside of the meeting. There might all be particular issues. Clearly, it's not always necessarily an internal issue. Developers, for their own purposes, sit on 106 agreements because they're not necessarily willing to sign them. It's not quite right in terms of their financing and all that sort of thing. So there may well be specific issues on specific sites, is what I'm saying.
If you like, I can have a look at the ones that are on here and provide you with some information if that would help.
Councillor Leach.
Yes, my questions are going to be on Rondor. Doesn't she out the same thing? 106. It seems to be hanging about for a long time. So if someone could tell me what is going on, are they sitting on it?
I think what I need to do is find out in each particular case, because there probably will be different reasons for, some may be that the applicant is not pursuing it, and others, I just need to find out the details of each of them. So if it's okay with you, if it's okay, I'll bring it back to the next meeting if that's acceptable.
The only one I'm minded of, I can't for the life of me remember the name of it, but we were going to consider, it was to do with a road in a development in Oakhampton. Remember, it was going to come to committee and then it didn't. And it was a legal issue that needed sorting out.
I mean, you're referring to the link road at in Oakhampton.
That's right.
Yeah. I think there is a report in progress, but I think there are also other issues in the background that need to be addressed.
Okay, so more work being done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's anticipated that it may be able to come to the next planning committee.
Okay. Councillor Leach.
Yeah, I was led to believe that that report was coming to this meeting. Just wondered why it's been.
So originally it was planned to come to this committee, but there was an error found in the report which needed to be corrected in terms of some case law that was being referred to. So we decided to hold it back until we'd corrected that error. I appreciate your frustration.
Any other questions on undetermined majors? Okay, we're going to move on to item 11. Just before we do, this is a planning enforcement update, and the enforcement officer will come and update us. I'm not intending at this meeting to go into individual enforcement cases. If anyone wants to do that, I suggest they take it up, take their concerns up initially with the officer dealing with that enforcement case. Otherwise, we'll be dipping in and out of part 1 and part 2, because we would have to go into part 2 if we were going to discuss a particular enforcement case. So this is a more general overview of enforcement, and we'll stay in part 1 and we'll stay live streaming for it. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So I've been asked to present quarterly updates to the committee on the performance of the planning enforcement team. So this report is covering the quarter from the 1st of April 2024 to the 30th of June 2024, and should have been included in all of the papers which were circulated to you. Firstly, can I apologise for an error in the report? Within the table for reasons for closure, on the row titled closed, not expedient, further action required, it should read closed, not expedient, no further action required. And I apologise that it was circulated with that error within it. Oh, excellent. It means I managed to catch it with this one. I think I probably sent it across. I'm apologising for an error that I obviously caught in time for publication for this committee. So within the figures which have been circulated to you, basically the background is to try and ensure that members are better informed of the performance within the planning enforcement team, and to give greater detail to you all on how resolutions are being made. One of the questions I've been asked to provide a little more information on is the row where it has closed at triage, to explain how cases are closed at triage and what the officers undertake. So at triage, we assess the planning breach notifications which are put in front of us. We undertake a desktop exercise to determine whether or not there is actually a breach, whether or not planning permission already exists, and we're trying to improve the service the planning enforcement team are making by resolving cases when they are first put in front of us, rather than kind of it taking a longer period of time. So trying to speed up the time it is taking for officers to determine planning enforcement cases. Officers are trying to make headway in clearing the older cases, and at the next report that will be brought to this committee, we will also be providing information on the age of cases, the oldest cases we're dealing with, but significant inroads are being made in resolving the oldest cases, and we are going to be trying to arrange meetings with you all as ward groups to go through the outstanding cases and to try and A, build closer working relationships with you all, but B, gain a bit more insight into some of these older cases and seeing whether resolutions can be reached in accordance with the planning enforcement plan. I thought it'd be really helpful to update you all on where we are at the end of June 2024. We had 111 open cases. To put that in context, at the end of June 2022, we had 182 open enforcement cases for West Devon, and at the end of June 2023, we had 139 open enforcement cases within West Devon. So hopefully that shows the greater emphasis which is being put on resolving the cases within West Devon. We now have 2 officers working solely on West Devon cases, as well as our senior enforcement officer, David Bate, who works both in West Devon and South Hams. And so we're really trying to make sure that the number of cases is coming down, and we would anticipate that a expected open workload would be somewhere around 75 open cases. That takes into account the fact that we get about 15 new cases each month, and with enforcement cases, they are not as quick to resolve as planning applications. If you're going down the route of serving a notice or even prosecuting, those cases stay open for a much longer period of time than you would get with a simple planning application, shall we say. Also within the report, you will have seen that we had 2 planning enforcement appeals, joint appeals, which were heard during the quarter. So those were the appeals at Meadowside, Eworthy. Both appeals were successful and the enforcement notices were quashed. We also served 2 further enforcement notices on other sites within West Devon, and we had 1 planning enforcement prosecution that was heard during that quarter.
Thank you very much for that. Questions? Councillor Moody.
Thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. I just wanted to establish the source of origination of these cases. I presume that a lot of them are from members of the public raising the issue with the council. That's reactive. So I want to know what the balance is between reactive and proactive. For instance, if a planning application has a condition that hasn't been fulfilled and the officers don't know about it, do they rely upon the public to report these things, or is there an act of looking at planning applications across the borough?
Unfortunately, we don't have the level of resource to be actively monitoring all planning applications which the council determine. We do monitor some cases, especially applications where there are so bigger developments where we have construction management plans, hours of working, things like that. We do actively monitor some, not all. Especially if there's been history, then we will continue to monitor even when there has been resolution to conditions in the past. The majority of the new cases we investigate do come in from members of the public, but also planning officers bring matters to our attention, other agencies, other staff within the council bring matters to our attention, parish councils, town councils, ward members obviously raise things as well, and some things we spot ourselves when we are investigating one matter. We'll see something else and we will investigate and create a new case.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Councillor Ewings, welcome.
Thank you very much. I had hoped to be here for most of the meeting. I said to Jack and Bryony, I'll see you in a minute, and but unfortunately, residents came in that were having an issue, so I was sat with them. I'll pick Ursula's brains later. All I was going to say is, I remember saying at the beginning of the council in 2023 that Councillor Bridgewater and myself, we used to actively keep our list to 0. That was always the aim, to keep it to 0. And it does behove us as members to really look at some of them and to sit down with the enforcement team and decide, actually, is it really worth us fighting the point on some of the older ones? And actually, I had some that were 2016, 2000, and even older, and actually we enforced what we needed to, but actually got rid of the rest of it. And I think some of you, if you went through your lists, sort of, I think they come out monthly, don't they now, Helen? You know, to look and see, you know, I know that I've got, actually it's 2, but one is up at the Tors, so I have to confess that's just, one is on a large development, one is on a residential property. And if you keep an eye on them, they can go through quite quickly. And if they're there for a few months, you know, I might drive around and have a look. But, you know, that is what we should be doing, because they do come across us. And to try and keep it to 0. That's, I mean, I'm quite competitive, and to me it was like, yeah, keep my list to 0 as far as possible. But really, we need to sort of look at them, and some of the more rural ones are quite difficult because they're buried in farmers' fields and things like that, and suddenly, you know, you might notice something that's not been there, and you think, and have a word. And I do realise that for rural wards, it is a little bit harder because you don't have members of the public reporting in the same way that you do in the towns, because they are our main reporters of what they perceive as an enforcement or something not quite right. So yeah, that's all I would like to say, is that actually we need to look at them quite diligently as members.
Thank you for that. And I think it reinforces, in my mind, also the value of the ward member and the enforcement team sitting down together. Because I remember we used to do it really quite frequently. I mean, at least every 6 months. And it was interesting how many you could bat off the table, because I mean, they really weren't issues that were annoying the residents of wherever they were. So those meetings, I think, are worth their weight. The other thing I was going to say is I very much like the new numerical where have we got to in this case. But an awful lot of them do tend to be, I think it's 4 to 8 or something like that, and it's impossible to know whether they're still at 4, moved to 5, nudging 6, at 7, or nearly popping out the other end. And I think a little bit of thinking about how we sort of open that box would be useful, because if an enforcement case is stuck in 4 to 8 for a year, you really don't know whether anything's happening to it or not. But again, that comes back, if we have these meetings, that's the opportunity for the enforcement team to tell us exactly where they are with each particular case. Councillor Mann.
I just was curious as to what the appeal process was and who decides the appeals and who brings them.
So the appeals, so planning enforcement appeals are lodged by the party that an enforcement notice has been served on, and they are heard by the planning inspector. So they follow the same sort of process as a planning application appeal, so it can be heard either by written representation, informal hearing, or public inquiry. At the moment, there is a significant length of time attached to planning enforcement appeals due to staffing issues that the planning inspector have got. You don't have as many planning inspectors who can hear enforcement appeals as you do with planning applications. So public inquiries have been taking sort of up to 12 months to be heard at the moment. With planning enforcement appeals, you are more likely to have them heard by way of informal hearing or public inquiry than purely written representation, because with a planning enforcement notice, it could be appealed on 7 different grounds, and one of them is that the matter has already become immune by the passage of time. That will nearly always be heard at public inquiry because they want the evidence to be given under oath and to be tested in that way. So there tends to be a longer period of time for a planning enforcement appeal to be heard. We are serving more notices now, which means that we will have more planning enforcement appeals. They kind of sit hand in hand, but the team have been working really closely with David and his team in legal, and there is more progression of formal action being taken.
Councillor Moody?
Thank you for that. That's quite interesting. I'm just wondering whether it might be advisable, or if I could request that those appeal decisions, that we get a copy of them as well and understand how those appeals have been won or lost, the same as with normal planning appeals. It just might be helpful for committee members to understand what's going on behind the scenes.
Yes, of course we can do that.
I mean, I think we could factor into our development management agenda an update from the appeals team to do that. Councillor Ewing?
Might I suggest that actually with member training that we've talked about for the team here, when you look at a case and what would you have done, Mrs. Smart could bring one from her so we could see how an enforcement case comes about, and I think that would help members quite a lot to see the processes of how that comes about. And one of them, I think, would be immunity with passage of time, and I think that would be a really good reason to sort of explore, because is the evidence relevant at the time, even though you've then had to wait possibly by the time you've done an initial investigation before it goes to an appeal, it could be, you know, well over the 12 months, and they would then argue the passage of time. But actually, it's the passage of time on the day it's reported that is the really important bit, isn't it? Because you've got your evidence then. And I think it would be really interesting to see how Mrs. Smart, you know, puts it together.
Absolutely, and we also have, I don't know whether dates have been put in your diaries yet, but Darryl and his team are putting together a date for us to go through the new planning enforcement plan with all members, so that I think is in early November. So we will hopefully discuss some of those matters at that time as well.
Thank you. I look forward to that. Any other questions on enforcement? No? Well, that draws us to the end of another exciting planning meeting. So, meeting to a close.